Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion on the role of AI in achieving sustainability. My name is Aaliyah Pollock, and I'm a data and technology analyst at the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. My role involves examining the impacts of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. Prior to this, I worked in GIS, which is geospatial science, with experience in both the military and construction industry. So moving back onto RICS, we're a leading professional body dedicated to advancing knowledge, upholding standards and inspiring current and future professionals. Our members play a crucial role in creating and protecting the built and natural environments that are sustainable, resilient and inclusive for all. Here at RICS, sustainability is a key focus for us as it underpins the quality of life, societal well-being and economic stability. One significant initiative we have at RICS is the whole life carbon assessment for the built environment. This standard is vital for measuring whole life carbon emissions, managing carbon budgets, and reducing life cycle emissions to deliver this overarching goal of a net zero future. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today. Now we'll move across to the introductions. Steve, let's start with you.
Good morning, everyone. It's 1:30 here in California. My name is Steve Bennet. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Firstplanit. My passion for the building industry began at a very early age, shadowing my father, who taught construction engineering and management at Purdue University near Chicago. Leading global initiatives at both Fortune 500 companies and startups has given me a deep understanding how to leverage technology and partnerships to drive change in an industry. Leading the design and build of my personal home in California inspired me to finally connect my passion for the building industry with my career when I joined Firstplanit. Firstplanit is a building products discovery and analytic insights platform. We enable industry stakeholders to drive sustainable change in the building industry by providing easy to understand insights about a product's environmental, health, social, and economic benefits. Our open platform allows people to assess products using a methodology which is most aligned with their project goals. We enable stakeholders to assess a product at the product, project, or portfolio level by leveraging various industry standards, including green building rating systems, whole life carbon assessments, and our proprietary algorithms. To conclude my introduction, I would like to ask everyone two questions. One, what does sustainability mean to you? And two, how do you best assess the progress the industry is making towards building a more sustainable construction sector? Thank you for allowing me to participate in the panel.
Thank you very much, Steve. Brittany, let's move across to you.
Hi, everyone. It's great to join you today. So I'm Brittany. I'm one of the co-founders of Flow. I'm a civil engineer by background, spent about 13 years in the industry now, starting my career with Mott MacDonald and Arup, spending some time working in Hong Kong with Laing O'Rourke, which was incredible, but a bit too hot for me. So I came back to the UK to work for Bureau Happold Engineering. And it was while I was working for Bureau Happold that I became very fixated on actually how we can make construction and engineering more sustainable. So my passion has always been around the circular economy and sustainability and ultimately building a more equitable future. And I really wanted to see how we could leverage actually our built environment to really enable that. So I'm now a fellow of the ICE, the Institution of Civil Engineers, and a member of the board of the Environment Agency here in the UK. So still very pursuing that passion of sustainability, and that really sits at the core of Flow. So Flow is making it easy for construction teams to understand the materials that they consume and the waste that they generate. And the reason that we focused in on this sort of very black box part of the industry is that we felt that firstly it was going unseen, but also it's one of our largest footprints. So as an industry, we consume about 40% of the world's raw resources, and we are the biggest single consumer of materials in the world within construction. And then on top of that, we also contribute 40% of waste to landfill. So this linear approach of extracting, refining, transporting, building with, taking down, and then disposing of materials is not only insanely wasteful and damaging to the planet, it's also not particularly profitable. And so we wanted to explore how we could unlock that circular economy for the built environment. And to do that, we needed really great data on what's available for reuse. So we think of our buildings as banks of materials that can be drawn from, but to draw from them, we need to know what's in the bank, and that's really what QFlow is doing. So today we work with general contractors and developers around the world, tracking what's going into those buildings, building a really detailed picture of everything that has contributed to these amazing bits of infrastructure, but also then using that to manage cost and quality during construction, account for whole life carbon. So we feed all of that data into whole life carbon assessments and assessment tools, but then also building up this detailed picture of exactly what's available for reuse in the future, so that when we come to refit or deconstruct and rebuild these buildings, we know what we've got accessible and we don't have to extract it from halfway around the world, emitting loads more carbon in the process. So that's QFlow.
Thank you, Brittany. Tom?
Wonderful. So my name's Tom Summers. I'm a director here at SkenarioLabs. So I lead our UK and Irish operations. As I'll come on to, we're an Anglo-Finnish business, to give the background to that. In terms of a little about my background, so I've generally been in and around the innovation space, around energy and the built environment. So I joined SkenarioLabs from Arup, where I set up their startup collaboration team. Prior to that, I was at the CVC team, sorry, I should say corporate venture capital team at Centrica, which is the group that owns British Gas. As well as those roles, I've worked in and around particularly the UK startup ecosystem. So in innovation roles, for example, in social housing, running an awful lot of accelerator programs, so effectively helping smaller businesses to develop, and particularly to build out relationships with larger supply chains and larger ecosystems as well, to make sure that some of the cool things that people are doing actually end up impacting on people's lives. In terms of who SkenarioLabs are, so as I said, Anglo-Finnish business, about 25 of us in total. We've been going since about 2015. What we do is we model extremely large portfolios of buildings. So that might be anything from a couple of hundred buildings for a social housing operator or for an owner operator of a certain asset class, all the way up to working with governments. So that might be looking at modeling an entire city, a whole region, a whole country, something like that. Fundamentally, what we're doing for those kinds of organizations is similar. So first, we help them understand those buildings. That might be things like exactly where they are, which some organizations struggle with, through to things like what they're made of, how they're used, their ages, what are their major systems, heating systems, cooling systems, those types of things. And then we apply different AI models, things like valuation models, things like particularly environmental risk models, so fires, floods, heat, cold. And probably what we're best known for, we run actually commonly understood, so the same models that a lot of RICS people will use, things like energy models, so heating, cooling models, heat loss models, all those sorts of things. And then we look to optimize. So we look for opportunities for retrofit, we look for opportunities for climate change mitigation. And the whole idea of what we're trying to do is we're trying to give kind of building by building relevant information and recommendations, but at a whole portfolio type level. So organizations can make a decision on, okay, where do we invest? Where do we have risks, stranding risks, things like that? And what roughly can we do about it? Then when we are bringing on experts, the kinds of people who are RICS members quite often, we're applying them in the right sorts of parts of our portfolio, not just sort of randomly throwing them at like 5% a year. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. I'll very briefly try and answer a couple of Steve's questions because he asked them and I feel like I should now. So what does sustainability mean to me? Very briefly, I think it's linking different types of sustainability. So environmental, social and financial. Like more people are getting into social sustainability, or at very least a sort of social impact, which I think is great. I think a lot of people are very nervous to talk about financial sustainability in the same sentence as environmental. it's not going to happen if we remain nervous about that. And then in terms of signs of development in the sector, there's loads. The fact we're all here is a good sign. I'd also say that a lot more people now, talking about sustainability, are talking about exactly what Brittany was discussing earlier, which is whole life carbon. You mentioned it yourself as well, Ayala, as well as things like, well, okay, what actually is a holistic impact of my project, not just the very short term one. So there you go. I've done my best, Steve.
Yes, thank you very much, Tom. Let's take a step forward and delve into the role of AI in promoting sustainability throughout the entire property life cycle. The built environment encompasses several critical stages, from initial planning and design to construction, use, and eventual reuse or repurposing of buildings. At each of these stages, AI can offer transformative insights and efficiencies that significantly enhance sustainability. So, starting off at the beginning, Steve, can you walk us through how AI can be integrated into the design process to enhance sustainability?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. I'd like to start my response. Thank you, Tom, for answering the question. But I'd like to start my response by answering it, providing my answer to those two questions. So what does sustainability mean to me? I think very similar to what Tom said. Sustainability means making the world a better place for people today and future generations. No, and I think, per Tom's comments, making the world greener but unaffordable isn't accomplishing our goals. And so I think it's a very complicated subject, which is why it's so important that we're talking about this. Number two, how do we gauge the progress towards this goal? Since we're in the very early stages of driving sustainable change, I think we should focus on three key areas. Number one, engagement. Are we involving a diverse set of stakeholders, and are their numbers growing rapidly? Number two, level of innovation. Are we seeing increasing investments in innovative solutions to help address sustainability challenges? And number three, level of transparency. Are we openly sharing data and information to build trust and accountability? So how can AI help in the design process to drive sustainable change? My simple answer is that it can be our intelligent assistant. It's intelligent assistant. There are four key areas that I believe AI could help in the short term. Number one, in the early design stage, AI can help educate us and help us to clarify our priorities. Tools like ChatGPT can answer questions about industry best practices and local regulations. Secondly, project definition. Once we've defined our project goals and constraints, AI can help find products and processes which align with these goals. At Firstplanit, we are developing the feature which enables designers to easily find products which are aligned with their project goals using something called natural language-based search, which I'll talk about later. As we move on into design iteration, as people iterate through their design, AI can solve difficult challenges by automating what-if scenarios to compare and contrast various concepts. And finally, automation of mundane tasks. Through all phases of the design process, AI can help to automate tasks such as compliance checks, which we all find tedious. In summary, our intelligent consistent will continue to evolve, enabling us to focus on more and more of our time on things that bring value to all.
Thank you, Steve. It's clear that AI tools like ChatGPT and natural language processing can help us create more efficient and sustainable designs right from the outset. But now let's transition from the planning and design phase to the actual construction of these projects. The insights gained during the design phase are invaluable, but the real challenge lies in translating those sustainable designs into practice on the construction site. So Brittany, could you shed some light on how AI can be leveraged during the construction phase to monitor and manage materials and waste effectively? Specifically, how can these AI-driven insights contribute to decarbonizing construction projects?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, if anyone's been on a construction site, you'll know the controlled chaos that it is. It's an amazing place to be, and it is phenomenal what humans can pull together. But it is incredibly complex, and particularly with the fact that we have a very fragmented and very under-digitized supply chain. The structure of a project, you will typically have a developer client, then you'll have your construction management team, who are normally, one of the big tier ones, and then you'll have dozens, if not sometimes hundreds, of subcontractors who are delivering specific works, very specialist trades and sort of more general labourers. Which means actually getting a clear and Steve, as you said, transparent picture of what's going on, and being able to track that actually that is being built in the way that we designed and specified, to the right standards for safety and for health, with volatile organic compounds and materials, but also for sustainability, is it responsibly sourced material. It's really hard to track when you've got so many different people involved, and it is largely an under-digitized process. It's still mostly done by paper. So the role that AI can play in actually helping us to address that transparency, to actually verify and validate that we're building what we set out to build, and that we're doing that safely, efficiently, and sustainably, is that it means that we can actually see the level of detail of what's coming onto site to a scale that we've never been able to do before. So what currently happens without AI and without technology is that you have a person who is physically doing spot checks. Now, you can't physically check every single delivery. You would have multiple people doing that on a daily basis on most projects. So that's not efficient. That's not a good use of people's time. Humans are terrible at looking at lots of data. We're amazing at spotting trends and just going through things, but actually, we're not good at crunching individual numbers. We are very error prone, and we like to skip things. So the AI is very good at processing vast quantities of data, being able to see down into the detail, check that when you said you want this material on site, what's been delivered actually matches that. And if it has changed, it can notify the project team so that they can use their amazing brains to say, within the context, that's fine. Or within the specification of this project, that material absolutely isn't fine and shouldn't be installed. So the AI gives us that scale, it helps us see the detail, it helps us spot trends and really see what's going on. So one thing that we often see within Qflow is key suppliers that are regularly substituting out materials that don't meet the project specs. So Qflow will audit everything that's coming onto the project, and then it will say, well, we keep notifying that this supplier has got different materials coming on, and so that allows the project management team to go and have a direct conversation and do the human thing and say, guys, we've got these special requirements for this project and it's got to be the right material. So, can you please make sure that you're not substituting in this instance? It's not acceptable for this site. And therefore we need to work together to find a way for the right material to come on the project so that we don't have to carry out very expensive and time consuming rework, so that we don't generate more waste. So the bit where AI really helps us be more sustainable is that with this transparency and this detail, we're able to prevent things going wrong. Now, the frustration for our industry is that proving a negative is really hard. So if you say, I've stopped something bad happening, most people don't like putting a number to that. So that's something that we've got to kind of figure out. However, there are some great reports out there that show just the vast amount of time and money we spend on rework. So we all know we do it. We know that as an industry, we've got a problem with that. We know that if we can use AI to help us prevent rework and not install the wrong stuff and not redo it, not only will we reduce our waste, making us more sustainable, but we will also save ourselves a lot of time and money and make us more efficient. So AI is unlocking that potential to do that at scale. It's saving us a lot of time and money during construction because we're not correcting our errors. And as a result, it's making us more sustainable. So coming back to Tom's point around, if sustainability isn't cost effective, it's not going to work. It sure as hell ain't going to work in construction because we are very money driven in this industry. We have wafer thin profit margins. This is a really nice example of where leveraging tech can help us save time and money, be more profitable, but also be more sustainable.
Thanks for that, Brittany. Tom, I'll move across to you. So once a building has been constructed, the shift focus across to its operational phase, where maintaining and enhancing sustainability remains crucial. The use of AI doesn't stop at construction. It extends into the day-to-day operations of buildings to optimize energy use, reduce environmental impact, and ensure efficient management. So, Tom, could you share how AI-driven platforms can assist businesses in effectively managing and reducing their environmental impact through the operational phase of buildings?
Absolutely, and I think you've provided quite a good summary of that yourself. But in terms of what we end up seeing typically in sort of the in-use phase of the usage of AI in kind of sustainable real estate, typically splits into two areas, not exclusively, but typically. One is around the facilities management, so the day-to-day operation of buildings, and the other is around the asset management, so the longer term sort of ownership and decision making around usually portfolios of buildings. And I'll talk about each in turn. So when it comes to facilities management, I think you see a lot of the similar sorts of challenges that we see in construction, especially. You know, managing a building, if anyone's worked in facilities management before, it feels just about as chaotic as building it in a lot of ways. There's always something going wrong. There's sometimes literally something on fire. There's a lot of different demands from a lot of different parts of the business, several of which can be diametrically opposed to each other. So certain activities and noise levels and heat levels and all kinds of things like that. AI is very, very, very good at taking kind of the pain out of the monitoring elements of that. So obviously, if you're going to look at things like, for example, a lot of organizations with larger, typically higher end office buildings have brought in lots of complex AI solutions linked to IoT. So all I really mean by that, Internet of Things devices, effectively just sensors, things that do stuff with the internet. What that can do, even at a smaller scale, is help you do things like monitor your temperatures. You can look at whether plant systems are on or off at various times. You can make sure that effectively, when a building is being used for a certain function, that the operations of the building itself help to benefit that function and don't impede it. And additionally, that you're not seeing additional wastage. So you can do things like, for example, monitoring the usage of the building. What, especially at the moment, something we're seeing is a lot of interest around kind of, can we condense office spaces? Does that allow us to close down floors? You could theoretically have people on every floor, counting the number of people in and out, in and out. There are a lot easier ways to do that. There are a lot of ways to automatically monitor that. And then you can take that to more interesting and advanced ways that we're seeing with things like HVAC units, heating systems as well, where we're seeing things like, for example, opportunities to really go beyond just the operation of the building and into the building's relationship with its environment. That's things like, for example, looking at opportunities for load balancing. So where there is cheaper energy, can we utilize AI to ensure that we're doing things like heating the building up or cooling the building down, as the case may be, at that point, and looking to avoid peak pricing? That's something that's really very, very, very interesting, where we're seeing things like, for example, substantial air pollution outside. Can we make sure we close all the windows? Or vice versa, if we're seeing a highly polluted environment indoors and it's a cleaner environment outdoors, at what time can you flush the building out with fresh air? Those kinds of things AI is absolutely great for. It's monitoring and it's combining data and then coming to a well understood outcome. Asset management is a really interesting one. So taking that longer view, the advantages of AI there are almost maybe more similar to the planning phase. It really is taking into account a lot of different inputs that are highly structured at their best and sometimes highly unstructured at their worst, and looking to achieve a very, very kind of complex outcome. And that's something where I've really seen AI do its best alongside a human. Fundamentally, machine learning is pattern recognition, and it's doing more of what it thinks is good. What it typically thinks is good is what you've told it is good. That can really lead to some very adverse outcomes, which we'll maybe come back to later when we talk about challenges. So I won't go too much on it now. But what it can really do is, I think anyone who's been in the phase of what on earth is happening in my portfolio, whether it's of buildings, of projects, of people, you sometimes just want to see it all in one go, and you want to move some sliders around and go, well, what happens if, for example, when it comes to sustainability, what happens if we see a 2 or 3 degree increase in peak summer temperatures? What happens if we see increased flooding in certain areas. What does that do to my very complex interactions? That's where AI can come in asset management. It's a very different kind of relationship, and it does, I think, require a lot more human in the loop, but can really allow for that kind of like quite complex decision making also by a human. So there you go. I won't go on any further.
Okay, it's great to hear how AI can aid sustainability right across the property lifecycle. But now let's focus on some of the hurdles AI faces in the built environment. Adopting new technologies isn't always straightforward, and there are challenges to overcome along the way. In order to implement technology like AI, we need a wide range of diverse data. However, there is this huge resistance to firms collaborating and sharing data, both internally and externally. Steve, why do you think this is the case? Where does the issue stem from?
Thank you for the question. I think it's obviously a very complicated question, but I think we can look at other industries which have been successfully transitioned to being more digitized to better understand the answers. I believe, based on my experience, I believe there are 5 main factors inhibiting data sharing in the building industry. Number 1 is regulatory capture. Power brokers in the industry have the most to lose when change occurs, especially when that change involves data transparency. These bodies are doing all they can to slow change to maximize their own benefits. Number 2, fear. Many companies are fearful that the data they share will be misinterpreted or, worse yet, misused. Number 3, time. We're all short on time. Sharing information and data requires a significant amount of time that people simply don't have. Number 4, lack of digitization and information sharing standards. The building industry, as other panelists have highlighted, is the least digitized sector in the world. The lack of digitized data and standards make it more difficult to share information with people from different backgrounds, which obviously the building sector has a very diverse set of stakeholders. And finally, fragmentation in the industry, which I think Brittany also highlighted. Complex supply chains and sales channels exacerbate the above factors. Companies may use the same suppliers and service providers as their competitors. Will the information they share end up in their competitors' hands, tying back to the fear above? Change is difficult, and most people tend to fear it rather than see it as an opportunity. At Firstplanit, I encounter these concerns daily in interacting with manufacturers requesting them to provide data. Frequently asked questions include, will my product be fairly evaluated on your platform? Number 2, time. I just don't have the time. I'll get to it next week. And number 3, how will the data be used and by whom? My guidance to them is that digitization and AI are coming to the building industry at an accelerating pace. Do you want to benefit from these changes or not? In summary, while the challenges are significant, embracing change and overcoming these barriers can lead to sustainable benefits for all stakeholders in the building industry.
Steve, you mentioned there about this fear about data potentially being misused. Do you think if there was a way for us to anonymize the sharing of this data, do you think that would still be an issue to collaboration?
I think it's a great first step. I mean, if you look at it in many other industries, healthcare is a really good example, right? Where you can share patient information that's aggregated, but you can't share patient information that isn't aggregated. So aggregation is a great first step. I think the real challenge, though, ultimately is that in order to make progress, we need to have information about specific products. How do you compare? The definition of sustainability is complex enough. If you can't compare the individual benefits of one product versus another, then I think answering that question, it just makes it that much more complex as to how you approach making a decision between selecting one process or product versus another. But it'll be a good start.
Thanks for that, Steve. Building on this topic of data, we all know that there are huge issues, specifically around data quality and standardization. It's actually a hot topic at the moment. Every conference I go to, data. What are some of the main challenges you've encountered with data quality and standardization? Brittany, I'll pose that question to you.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because you're right, they're talking about it a lot at conferences, and I get sort of two ends of the stick from people. One is like, the industry's drowning in data, we've got loads of it. And then there's the other side of people who go, our data's so bad we can't use it. And both are true, which is sort of ironic and frustrating, I think, for the industry. The biggest challenge we've got is that, yeah, we have a lot of data, but it's in formats that can't really be analysed. Often it's paper-based. Occasionally it's still held on a 3/4 inch floppy under someone's desk. Believe it or not, you're still finding one or two of those. But most commonly they're held sort of in sort of spreadsheets across multiple different systems, and they can't really talk to each other. So there's the accessibility point. The other side of it is the completeness. We have lots of data, but very rarely are any of those data sets complete, meaning being able to train AI on it and actually analyze it in any meaningful way is very difficult, because you're only capturing part of the picture. So one thing that we see really commonly during construction is that it's very easy to get things like cement and concrete data, because that is one part of the supply chain that's actually moved on pretty effectively to try and provide more digital information and be more complete, particularly because there is such a strict requirement around managing the structural stability of concrete. So there's good data on that, but then you go to MEP data and no one's got a clue, and we're not tracking some of those smaller bits, and actually getting a complete picture of what goes into a building is nigh on impossible right now. So despite having lots of data, it's not very complete, and therefore it's very hard to really get a good picture of what's going on in your supply chain. Where are the vulnerabilities? One thing that we experienced a couple of years ago when the war in Ukraine kicked off, all of a sudden timber coming from Russia and Belarus, which is a huge supplier to the UK, was now listed as conflict material. And so it was no longer FSC certified. And so for projects that had that requirement, couldn't source from that area. But most projects had no idea where their timber was coming from. They didn't know whether they had supplier support sourcing from that way. So it's very hard for them to very quickly pivot and say, do we need to change our expectations and accept conflict materials, or do we need to change our suppliers? And if so, who do we need to go to? And so without complete and sort of accurate data, it's very hard to make those decisions. The final thing I would say is that actually from the data perspective, the accessibility and the quality is really important, but the context, I would say, is the most important thing. And this is a big limit of AI. So AI is a great enabler. It's a fantastic co-pilot to people, which is a phrase that's getting thrown around. And I think it's a really great describer of what AI can do. But it still requires that human context. It still requires the project manager on site knowing that, yeah, that's okay though, we can deal with that being different, or whoa, that's important, that's going to block the installation of something else, and that's going to absolutely massively delay our program, and we need to be focusing on that. The AI won't, at the moment, doesn't have the richness of that context to be able to understand some of those independencies, which it may be able to do in the future, but also the relationships. And actually the human relationships on construction sites are some of the most important things when you spend time there, and some of the politics between client and contractor and subcontractor. So data is really important, and it will help us make those decisions, but you will always need a human in the loop to have that context and to be able to bring in the emotional side of decision making during construction.
So moving on, we need to consider the overall structure of the real estate industry. This industry is often described as fragmented, with numerous stakeholders, subcontractors, and varying standards and practices. So Tom, I'll pose this question to you. How does the fragmented nature of the industry affect the implementation of AI technologies?
I think I'll pick up from something that Brittany was talking about, which is standards. And I'll maybe answer the question in a slightly unusual way, because naturally having loads and loads of different firms and very complex supply chains inherently makes it very challenging to do something like this. But I think everyone knows that. I think particularly when we're talking about things like standards, in particular, there's the old joke which comes from a super nerdy part of the internet, which is everyone gets very upset that there's 14 competing standards. They agree that they should do differently and create a universal standard, and now there are 15 competing standards. Like, that happens all the time. And we shouldn't just keep doing it, but we will. I think actually there's a really interesting different kind of split in construction specifically, and I say this as someone who's not an engineer, and so people can very welcome to disagree with me heartily. It usually makes a more interesting conversation if they do. There's a real split in terms of what we trust people to do in construction. There are engineers and there are people who actually do the work, and that's a joke, obviously. But the challenges that we see are, for good reason, I want to really make clear, the kinds of frameworks and the kinds of standards that we have in construction are usually very complex, and we typically don't trust people on the front line to implement them correctly. And we see that over and over again. We end up bringing an engineer out to site, a surveyor out to site, and make sure people have done it right. And the example I'll give to that is a passive house standard, which I'm sure people know a lot about. So passive house standard, really great house building standard, looking to ensure that you're not needing to bring in too much additional energy. The exact definition can vary slightly. That is enormously expensive, and you see lots of people say they build to a passive house standard, but that are not passive house certified. The reason it's not certified is because most of that cost is bringing in a surveyor every 3 minutes to come and make sure that the people building the house have built it right. That, I think, is actually the fragmentation within the sector that makes this very, very hard to do. And I think that's true. Certainly, I mean, we work across a whole bunch of geographies, and sometimes people are very open about that. And we saw that in places like Turkey, for example, where tragically, of course, we've seen the outcome of building standards being great in theory, but poor in practice. But I think we see that in every major market, including in the UK. And I think what the sector needs to do is establish ways of actually building out greater levels of trust within all levels of the sector. And that is, of course, going to go both ways. I think the temptation so far, because we kind of have that two-tier engineer and construction worker split in a lot of sites, not all, we end up basically monitoring and taking a very patrician approach to things about going, well, we'll watch every part of the site and we'll make sure you're doing what you said you're doing. I don't think that's going to work. And so from my perspective, actually figuring out ways of bringing everyone with us on a journey towards sustainability, on a journey towards implementing standards, that to me is really important. So that's what I talked about at the beginning about like linking environmental and social sustainability in particular. There you go. Not the answer I thought I'd give, but hopefully something a bit different.
So now that we've discussed some of the key challenges to the adoption of AI, let's explore some of the solutions. Overcoming these barriers is essential for the successful adoption and integration of AI technologies. So Steve, let's start with you. Leading on from my previous point, there is this fear in the industry about adopting new technologies. And this is understandable, as changing the way we work can be daunting, especially in a fairly conservative thinking industry like ours. What strategies can be employed to address this fear and these misconceptions about AI amongst industry professionals?
It's a very difficult question to ask because change affects everyone differently. I believe the best approach is enable people to embrace change. Begins with understanding their fears and asking probing questions to uncover the reasons behind their resistance. Questions I like to ask include, how have you been impacted by change in the past? What do you think the impact of this change will be on your current job? Do you have enough time to learn new skills to prepare you for this change? Once I understand their concerns, I ask what they know about the technology and how they came to those conclusions. Common misconceptions about AI I've encountered include, AI was invented last year by ChatGPT. Computers now can think like humans. AI will take my job and I will not be able to find a new one. Let's break down those concerns. AI is not new. It's been around for over 50 years. The recent buzz about AI is driven by a new technology called generative AI. Advances in computing power in AI models, known as large language models or LLMs, have enabled computers to answer increasingly complex questions. However, generative AI builds on three technologies we've used for years. Search engines. We've had search engines like Google for decades. Recommendation engines. Have you ever used an app like Yelp to get a restaurant recommendation? Personal assistants. We've had Siri, Google Assistant. I was involved at Amazon in developing Alexa. There's something that we've interacted with for a very long time. The second misconception is that AI-enabled computers think like humans. While they do produce answers similar to humans, they currently lack reasoning ability or common sense. Though you could say that about many humans, look at them as expert fortune tellers who guess at the most likely answer, and they're frequently wrong. I'm confident AI will have a positive impact on the world if we learn to harness its benefits. A historical example demonstrates this well. Consider the introduction of the ATM at Barclays Bank in the UK in 1967. Many feared that ATMs would eliminate most bank teller jobs. Instead, the exact opposite happened. The increased efficiencies created by ATMs led banks to open more locations in underserved markets, benefiting more people. This also resulted in increased teller jobs, which became higher paying because they required additional skills. Did this technology solution make the world a better place for people? I believe so. In summary, the best approach to enable people to embrace change is to understand their perspective and guide them through the potential benefits of adopting new ideas incrementally.
Thanks, Steve. Just another question to fire back at you. How do we ensure that the next generation isn't de-skilled due to this wave of AI? If it's going to potentially replace or change our traditional roles, how can we ensure that the next generation still maintains these traditional skills?
It's a really great question. In fact, one of the business I was thinking about starting before I left Amazon addressed that exact factor. I think if we look at it from the perspective of AI being an intelligent assistant, but as Brittany highlighted, you always need those experts. I think what this could enable, first, for like the journeyman, tradespeople, it could enable them to transition their job from doing hands-on work to basically being an inspector on the site for more junior people, or a coach for tradespeople on site. As AI evolves, and maybe you have, as Tom highlighted, sensors on site, or you had cameras on site that enable you to better understand the construction site, a person could be sitting behind their desk and looking at the different parts of the construction site from their desk versus going on site. I think the other piece to that, again, is the people now that are early in their careers. And I think the key there, again, is to get them to embrace AI and realize that, as Brittany highlighted, there's lots of jobs that computers and robots just aren't very good at. And so the more we can, really focus our investments in technology and AI to enable people to focus on tasks that they're best able to do, again, will enable better paying jobs, very similar to the Industrial Revolution.
Thanks, Steve. Now, looking at construction, as we aim for more sustainable construction practices, tracking and reducing carbon emissions is essential. Brittany, how do you think that we can increase the usage of carbon monitoring across construction projects?
Yeah, I think kind of as Steve was saying, there's so many different ways that we can apply AI to help us ultimately scale up what we're already trying to do. So there's a lot of, the UK is still leading on this in many ways. Sort of globally, we're a bit further ahead than the US and Australia, we're behind a few people in Europe, particularly the Netherlands is very good at trying to sit on top of really the embodied carbon piece. But ultimately, what's happening on site is that we're spending a lot of manual time trying to get a grip on what's going on. So as Steve said, there are ways that we can automate and use AI to help us automate the manual bits that humans are very good at, but also we can do that at scale. I think that, just to come back to one of the things that Steve said in terms of the new skills that have come through, what we're going to see is that people are going to have to learn to work with these co-pilots and learn to ask the right questions in the right way. And it's been sort of loosely termed a prompt engineer, someone who knows how to work with the AI and how to query it to get the right information out. I think these are the kinds of new skill sets that we're going to have to be developing as engineers. But to be able to ask the right questions, you are still going to need all the foundational knowledge around, you know, what kind of rebar you would be expecting within this slab, what kind of process you expect to pour a slab and to test the cement and the concrete, because AI will always live within the virtual world. You may have robots, you know, taking actions off the back of it, but it is still a virtual system. You need to have someone there who's going to help it interface with the physical world and to input data into it and say, well, we ran a slump test. Here's the data from the slump test. Now what can you tell me? So I think there's the evolution of our relationship with AI in construction is going to be incremental, and it's obviously going to be wrapped in some lovely, warm, caring arms that make sure that we do it safely without too much risk, because in industry we are terrifyingly risk averse, but for the right reasons, and because we are doing dangerous things. But I think the key part that we're going to have to sort of start thinking about is how we upskill and how we work with that AI, and also most importantly, how we get the right data to feed it. I sort of coming back to something I said earlier, it's really about the completeness of the information we give it, giving it sufficient context to provide us with valuable information. Otherwise, you're going to have the sort of common adage that you hear in the US, which is trash in, trash out. So that's a real risk with us in terms of leveraging AI in our industry, because our data is not yet at the standard that it really needs to be to empower it. But there is also a risk that we don't have the skills to fully leverage it in terms of querying and working with that AI. So yeah, thinking about how we can increase the monitoring of carbon during construction, I think one of the main things we've got to think about as an industry is how do we make it easy and accessible for the project teams, and that applies to anything, you know, whether it's carbon monitoring or safety monitoring or, you know, activity monitoring. It's about ease of access. So kind of to what I said earlier when we were talking about construction sites, they are very busy, very hectic places. And if you're asking people to spend lots of time, you know, manually typing data into forms and things like that, you're just not going to get good quality data because people will rush it, or you're going to miss things in general. So one of the things we focused really hard on is how can we eliminate friction in that process for people capturing data. So with QFlow, it's just done through a photograph. You take a photo of the piece of paper that comes on with those material deliveries and goes off with that waste. So it's super, super light touch. It's very, very low tech literacy. Pretty much everyone can take a selfie these days. So that was our sort of tech literacy threshold for most people. But it means that you are capturing that data and you're not giving it the chance to get lost. Tom mentioned IoT devices earlier. If you can, you know, get an independent system collecting that data, then that's a much easier way to make sure that it is being monitored regularly. But equally, you know, you don't need to monitor and track absolutely everything, because then once you've got that data, you've got to do something with it for it to be worthwhile and to be cost effective. So finding the easiest, lowest friction, but also most cost-effective way to collect that data is a surefire way of making sure that you're getting value, and that actually you are learning from it. But it is always taking into account the human element in that data capture. You know, are IoT devices going to get in the way? Are they going to be hit by a crane? That kind of thing. If you're asking to manually collect data because it is a physical system, then, you know, how can you make sure that they're doing that in as light a touch, low complexity way as possible? And definitely trying to eliminate forms, because the amount of forms people have to fill out is just mind-boggling. And having been a site engineer, I personally hated them, and I've also seen how much people just go, oh, I'll just select any old thing and send it off and be like, I've done it, who cares? So avoid those forms.
Thanks for that. Tom, building on this idea of data, how can companies ensure that they are collecting and using the right data at the right time?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that we see quite a lot, which is that there's this automatic assumption, I think actually especially on people who are in data and AI and all that side of the world, that more data is better and it's always better. And we simply just, the solution to everything is that we need to be able to share all the data with everyone all the time. I mean, so everything happening. And that is fundamentally not true and opens up a whole variety of risks. Risks that we've actually seen kind of financially realized when you see a lot of the kind of actual results linked to things like virtual assistants, things like Amazon Echo, Google, all the rest of them. And when you actually see what those things do financially, they make enormous losses. And that's because they're collecting and analyzing and storing spectacular amounts of data for not a very clear commercial reason. Now, in terms of how that translates through to this sector and sustainability, I'll go back to something I kind of talked about before, which is this split between facilities management use cases and asset management use cases. So, for example, we love talking about smart meter data in the UK because we're very proud that we rolled out loads and loads of smart meters, some of which still work. In terms of what we are getting from those, we're seeing like 10-second data. So every 10 seconds, we're seeing how much energy has a building used, or even in some cases, sub areas of a building. That can be really useful if you're wanting to do like very, very specific, very time intensive work on the facilities management side of things. So for example, if you're wanting to do what I talked about before, like opening and closing windows at the right time to save energy and ensure a nice healthy internal atmosphere, it can be really interesting to be doing things like kind of effectively energy trading, grid balancing, all that kind of stuff. That's great. However, when you try and take that same approach over to asset management, so we see a lot of people trying to utilize like 10-second meter data to figure out whether they have the right window installed. You don't need it. But it's not helpful, and actually it's actively costing you money. Data isn't free. Storing data isn't free. It's probably, for a lot of large businesses now, one of their biggest expenses, and a lot of organizations aren't really aware of it because it just sort of lives in the background. It's not anyone's biggest problem. But if you're trying to figure out, like, do I go from a single glazed window to a double or a triple glazed window, you can do that using like your good old fashioned monthly meter data, the sort of stuff that people are recording already. And it also goes back a little bit to kind of something we've broadly discussed, which is, I think Brittany, you mentioned it, sort of talking about how we've got all of this data, but it's not usable. And actually, a lot of what the sector really needs is the kind of basic data that it's been collecting for a long time for good reasons, and turning it into something that's a bit more machine readable. So that can even be basic stuff like addresses. We work with loads of banks and insurers. They have addresses that look like things that say like ground floor, high street, insert postcode here. That's not usable like for a machine. Like a human understands it through like whatever associated context because you know who your clients are, for example. That's not something that a machine learning algorithm is going to be able to learn reasonably at all. So, okay, what do we need to do? We need to translate that basic data, those addresses, that energy data, that existing site management data, that sort of data you're using, for example, in your day-to-day facilities management. Can we use AI both to make the collection of that easier, but can we also ensure that we're feeding the AI the right level of data in ways that it can understand it? So good structure, the clear data requirement, again, going back to something we've talked about before, like going into those kinds of formats that are going to be fairly shareable. So really, while a lot of the time when talking about these big, exciting, scary amounts of data, actually doing the basics really, really well is going to give you the biggest bang for buck 9 times out of 10.
Just a question to everyone, looking at the issues we've all mentioned around tech, AI, sustainability and data, what do you think professional bodies like the RICS could do?
I think a lot of the conversation around AI is assuming that it's new, and it isn't. Like Steve talked about this earlier. And I think it is because we've got ourselves very excited about, quite reasonably, by the way, it is very exciting, but around this concept of effectively general purpose AI, i.e. AI that can do anything. That concept's been around forever. It's very interesting and cool, and I think we are working our way towards it. But in terms of what's actually relevant to the sector and what's actually relevant to like members' careers and lives, a lot of it is quite specific purpose AI. So it's AI doing a thing for a reason with the desired output. I think engaging with AI on those kinds of levels is going to make it a lot more meaningful. I think a lot of, like Steve mentioned, the regulators before, they end up getting very excited about effectively Terminator or all the rest of it. And yeah, they should be, the regulators. But at the same time, I'm much more interested in the really specific implementations of AI that people are doing that are making differences, but also have really substantial risks associated with them. And I think that's where I'd like to see industry bodies like RICS engage, because effectively you guys are where the expertise lives to ensure that we don't go wrong with those kind of industry specific implementations.
I would just build on what Tom said, and actually it's coming back to something Steve said earlier as well, is I think it's about asking the right questions, and RICS can certainly help the membership know what questions to ask to be able to get comfortable and to be able to stress test, you know, is this an AI that's just there to look sexy, or is this one that's actually going to help me do my job? And if it is going to help me do my job, what skills do I need in order to leverage it? I think the other thing is that, you know, RICS has this tech partner program, which is brilliant because, you know, you've done a little bit of due diligence on the organizations that you're sort of working with there. I think that kind of sort of, it's not a certification, but that kind of green tick of, yeah, we've checked these guys out and they're not complete idiots, and they're safe, they're certified, you know, they've got ISO certification and that kind of thing. I think that helps give people that just initial layer of confidence enough to engage as well, because for many people, you know, it does look very new, as Tom said, and it's hard to know what to look for when you've not looked previously. So I think RICS could definitely play a role in helping to identify what questions to ask, but also doing that first layer of, yeah, these guys know what they're doing and they're not going to, you know, use your data in nefarious ways, really.
Yeah, to build on Brittany's comments, I think about what I highlighted as the different factors I evaluate in assessing progress, right? So enablement, I think obviously it's what, you know, Brittany and Tom have talked about, right? How do we help educate people to help them stop fearing it? How do we bring people together? Level of innovation, right? Again, the tech partner program is enabling, you know, people who have innovative solutions to highlight those solutions. And then finally, transparency, and then just to build on Tom's comment, but both transparency and simplification, right? There's way too much, I think Brittany said, right? There's way too much data and there's not enough data, right? And so the more we can really help people understand what data is important, and then make sure that you validate, you know, that we work together to validate that data, I think all those will help to move the industry forward.
Thanks everyone for your comments there. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the challenges and barriers to the practical strategies for overcoming them. Now, as we look ahead, I'd like to hear from each of you about where we currently stand and where you see the future of AI and sustainability, say the next 5 to 10 years. So again, we'll go around the table.
I think where we are now with AI is fundamentally a transitional phase. But we're really seeing the changes in hardware that underpin a lot of the capabilities in the software. But it's not very long ago, it's a couple of years ago, that we saw like chatbots just as utter garbage, and a lot of them still are. We're seeing, like, going from a couple of years ago where like AI generated images were just obvious and rubbish and couldn't do hands properly and all that sort of thing, and where AI generated video basically didn't exist, to a stage now where AI imagery is pretty good and can pretty reliably do hands. AI generated video is currently fairly obvious, unless it's like really specifically chosen otherwise. Like, and the reason I'm going away from kind of our specific use cases is because that's where we're seeing a lot of the development that I think everyone can understand. Like, we're seeing stuff change so quickly. I don't actually think that we know entirely. Like, when you talk about 10 to 15 years, which is the kinds of boundaries that real estate thinks in, but is not the kinds of ways that tech thinks. That is very interesting to me, because I think that a lot of the digital enablers are going to be there to do some really, really exciting things. I think it's going to be, especially in kind of a couple of years, in that sort of 5-year horizon, going to be the opportunity for real estate to really figure out how it wants to harness that, and if it wants to harness that as well, which is a perfectly reasonable question. 10 years, I couldn't tell you. I'm not going to pretend to be able to.
Yeah, I think sort of tying it a little bit more closely to construction, we're sort of playing at the fringes right now, and we're definitely butting up against the limits of our data. And I think this is one thing where what I'd really love to see in the next sort of 3 to 5 years is for our industry to really start moving towards more digitally and more openly integrated systems. So it's about getting comfortable with sharing data as part of it, but also, you know, the physical tech architecture that sits behind it as well. The reason being is that, so when we founded Qflow, when we first said, you know, we want to capture all this data from the suppliers, and we want to use that to help inform people where there's risks and there's opportunities to improve. We went out and we sort of met a load of these suppliers and realized they're still using physical paper filing cabinets to log what they've been delivering, and they're using the 3-page carbon copies, which AI will never be able to leverage. It's got to be digitized first. And so with Qflow, we had to build an entire system to turn paper into digital information to be able to enable that. I do not want to be doing that in 3 to 5 years. It's funny because investors that we spoke to at that early stage were like, no, construction will be entirely digital within 3 years. Like, why are you building a system that's going to turn? It's going to be completely useless. 6 years down the line, 95% of the information we ingest is still paper-based. So only 5% has turned to digital, and that's mostly the concrete guys and the occasional waste carrier. So I would love to see our industry start, when I say the industry, I mean the full supply chain, moving towards more digital systems that mean that we can leverage the AI. But right now, the AI, as Tom said, is accelerating into oblivion, you know, drawing hands and inventing music, and our industry is very much being held back, not able to fully leverage the potential there because our data and our digital architecture isn't there to enable it. So that's where I think we still are today, and where I hope we can move away from quickly. It will make part of what we do irrelevant, but I would be very happy with that, because it means we can move on to the more exciting stuff, which is actually using that data to do more exciting things. So that's my sort of 3 to 5 year outlook. However, the pessimistic side of me will say that will take 10 to 20 years. So we'll see. Let's hope I'm proved wrong.
Just like self-driving cars.
Yes, yeah.
The last 50 years, yeah.
Sure, I think consistent with what others are saying, the building, my perception is the building industry is gradually beginning to experiment with generative AI applications, focusing mainly on business process automation, including data acquisition. For example, I think several people have highlighted the importance of, quote, complete data. But how do we accomplish that when, even for a given product, data is located on multiple systems, often paper-based, and always in different formats? At Firstplanit, we make extensive use of generative AI to find, digitize, and connect data from multiple sources. And again, the goal is, very consistent with what we've talked about in this call, is to enable customers to search an extensive library of products which are evaluated cradle to cradle based on all these different factors we've talked about, right? Environmental, social, health, and economic. How affordable is a product? Other companies are offering solutions, I think, similar to what Tom's talking about, to simplify space design. So there's a lot of investment going on in that space now. And then visual search, entering an image and it's going to go find you similar spaces. The three applications that I see that are currently receiving the most attention for future investment are: one, auto GPTs. Auto GPTs allow users to complete complex tasks by communicating with an AI agent similar to human interaction. Auto GPTs could drive adoption of green building rating systems by significantly reducing the time and cost associated with these projects. And I think it was Brittany or Tom, I can't remember who was highlighting, the passive house, right? What makes passive house so expensive, as others have highlighted, is all the overhead associated with planning and executing those builds. I think auto GPTs can really help there. Natural language-based search, as I highlighted earlier. Finding building materials that align with your design intent is challenging enough. Adding sustainability criteria to that search makes it exponentially more difficult. Natural language search enables users to perform complex database searches interactively using terms that are familiar to them. Additional AI, I think this is something also people have talked about, AI facilitates complex what-if analysis often in minutes, which I believe will promote the adoption of sustainable building products and practices. And finally, this is the one that people are pretty scared about, is something called personal GPTs. So look at personal GPTs as a digital extension of your mind. They continuously learn from you. It's your own private model, your personal experience, and provide guidance tailored to your unique personality and style. Writing, I use ChatGPT all the time to refine my speeches, but it can never use my input to understand my communication style. That's what personal GPTs are about. But I think, related to the building industry, personal GPTs hold significant promise for creatives, enabling them to quickly generate content which is tailored to their unique goals. Again, understanding the individual versus ChatGPT is like, what does everyone think? And I think, Tom, you said it, right? Everything's biased, right? We're biased, computers are biased. It all depends on the data that you use to train the models. So in summary, in my opinion, the current impact of AI in the construction sector is pretty minimal, at least in the design phase. Lots of cool ideas, but in reality, not super. However, as government regulations and social justice momentum accelerates the need for change, AI holds significant potential to drive change in the near future. In wrap up my response, which we've talked about a little bit already, I would like to provide my assessment of where we stand in driving sustainable change in the building industry based on the criteria I highlighted earlier. Engagement. We talked about this, right? Organizations like RICS are helping greatly to bring people together to unite us towards a common goal and mitigate the problems that Tom talked about adding yet another standard. Level of innovation, and we're seeing significant advances being made across the industry in innovative materials and more eco-friendly manufacturing processes. We must all work together to showcase and build on these advances. And finally, level of transparency. As Brittany highlighted, this is an area that we've made, and Tom, made very limited progress. We must align on objective approaches to evaluate buildings and products and drive digitization of data. I am very optimistic that through the help of RICS, we will come together to make the world a better place.
Thank you all for your valuable insights. It's clear that AI has the potential to drive sustainability in the built environment, and it's encouraging to see the progress that is being made. But as we all know, there is still a lot of hurdles in the way of achieving that. In closing, I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their expertise and to the audience for listening to this discussion. As a takeaway, let's continue to talk, listen, collaborate, and innovate to create a more sustainable future. Thank you all.